Hey guys, tonight we journey deep into the harsh reality of medieval life, not to admire castles or kings, but to uncover why you wouldn't last a day in those times. While the Middle Ages gave us stories of knights and legends, it also exposed brutal hardships, relentless dangers, and challenges that tested every breath. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I share here. And drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I love seeing who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's slowly ease into tonight's journey together. The banquet table's lined with dishes no one dared taste first. Imagine yourself stepping into a grand medieval hall, its vaulted ceilings stretching high above, bathed in the warm flicker of countless candles. Long wooden tables stretch from one end of the room to the other, polished and worn by years of service, heavy with the weight of silver platters and elaborately crafted dishes. The air is thick with the mingling scents of roasted meats, spiced stews, and sweet pastries, all aromas carefully blended by cooks who had labored for days in the castle's kitchens. Yet despite this opulence, a peculiar silence lingers, a subtle hesitation weaving through the noble guests seated around the tables. This is the scene at many a royal banquet in the Middle Ages, where the grandeur often concealed an undercurrent of unease. The banquet tables lined with dishes no one dared taste first. In an age long before refrigeration or modern food safety, concerns about the freshness and safety of food were very real, even among the elite. Imagine the cooks and kitchen staff, working behind thick stone walls, preparing meals days or sometimes weeks ahead, carefully spicing and preserving ingredients to extend their shelf life. Their skills were essential, yet even their expertise could not always guarantee that every dish was free from spoilage or worse. In a world where foodborne illness could swiftly devastate a household, nobles often found themselves caught between the desire to indulge and the fear of falling victim to tainted fare. This atmosphere bred a certain ritualized caution. Stories from various chronicles tell of nobles who, despite the elaborate presentation, would avoid being the first to sample the food placed before them. Instead, they waited for others to take the risk, their eyes darting across the table for signs of health or distress in their fellow diners. The practice created a delicate social dance, where courage and caution intertwined beneath layers of etiquette. The first bite was a gamble, one that could mean savoring a meal fit for a king or suffering the consequences of an unseen hazard. Consider the social dynamics that shaped these moments. Among the aristocracy, reputation and appearances mattered immensely. To appear unafraid, eager, or impatient to eat was one thing. To fall ill after the meal was another altogether. The nobles were aware of the power that such events held. Not only a feast for the senses but also a subtle display of political strength and social standing. The act of tasting first carried symbolic weight, a quiet demonstration of bravery and trust. Yet more often, the dance of waiting prevailed. Guests would lift their goblets in toasts, engage in polite conversation, and occasionally nibble at safer items, all while avoiding the central platters that had been passed around. The silence that settled over these tables was not the silence of comfort or ease, but a quiet tension, a shared understanding that something intangible hovered in the air. Imagine the hall filled with finely dressed figures, their elaborate gowns and velvets rustling softly as they shifted in their seats, eyes cautious and calculating. Each face held a composed mask, but beneath lay the flicker of worry. Would this meal nourish or harm? In some accounts, nobles were said to exchange knowing glances, subtly signaling their suspicions or experiences to one another without uttering a word. This phenomenon reflects a broader rhythm of medieval life, an existence continually negotiating the precarious balance between luxury and risk. The grand banquet was not merely about sustenance. It was a stage where the fragility of life was acknowledged beneath layers of finery. Food that could delight might also conceal danger, and even the highest ranks were not immune to the uncertainties of their time. The preservation methods used then were limited, yet clever. Salt curing, smoking, pickling, and spicing were common techniques aimed at extending the life of food. Spices, particularly those imported from distant lands, were prized not only for their flavors but also for their supposed medicinal properties. Imagine the sharp, aromatic wafts of cinnamon, cloves, and pepper mingling with roasted game, creating a sensory tapestry that both invited and warned. Yet even with such methods, the risk of spoilage remained, especially when large quantities had to be prepared in advance for feasts intended to impress or celebrate. In addition to genuine fears of food poisoning, there were also concerns about more sinister possibilities. Poisoning, whether political or personal, was a very real threat in courts and noble households. The hesitation to be the first to taste could, in some instances, stem from the desire to avoid falling victim to such plots. The practice of appointing a taster was one method employed by royalty to safeguard themselves, a trusted individual who sampled the food first to detect any harmful substances. While such measures provided some reassurance, they also underscored the underlying dangers that accompanied the pageantry. As the evening wore on, the initial silence would often give way to cautious sampling. Small bites, tentative sips, and careful observation marked the progression of the meal. Guests watched for signs. Does the wine bring color to the cheeks or pallor? Does the food settle well or unsettle the stomach? These subtle cues shaped the collective judgment about the meal's safety and enjoyment. Over time, as confidence grew or concerns eased, the atmosphere relaxed, and the feast unfolded more fully. Yet, even as some dared to taste, the underlying tension persisted, woven into the fabric of medieval feasting culture. The experience was a constant reminder of the delicate balance between abundance and vulnerability, between celebration and caution. Imagine the flickering candlelight reflecting off polished silver, the soft clinking of glasses, and the murmurs of conversation. Yet beneath it all, a silent pact of shared awareness that not all was as it seemed on the banquet tables. This interplay between sensory richness and guarded restraint captures much about the rhythms of aristocratic life. It reveals how even in moments of apparent indulgence, the fragility of health and trust shaped behaviors and social rituals. The banquet became a microcosm of a world where the stakes were high, and survival often depended on reading subtle signals and navigating unseen threats. To look beyond the hall, one can glimpse how these dynamics contrast with the experiences of ordinary people of the time. For the peasantry, access to such lavish food was rare or non-existent, replaced instead by simpler fare shaped by the seasons and local harvests. Yet even for them, the concern over food safety and spoilage was a daily reality, though without the veneer of ceremony. The noble banquet's cautious tasting ritual thus also stands as a reminder that uncertainty about what we consume is a thread common across all layers of society. In reflecting on this, imagine yourself returning to that medieval hall, the scents and sights now mingling with a deeper understanding. The hesitation, the silence, the small gestures of bravery, all speak of a time when food was not merely nourishment but a symbol of trust, power, and the precariousness of life itself. The banquet tables, laden with dishes no one dared taste first, offer us a glimpse into a past where every bite was a delicate negotiation, a quiet story whispered between the clinking of goblets and the rustle of silk. As the candles burn low and the evening fades, the echoes of these whispered fears and hopes linger, reminding us that history is not only told in grand battles or sweeping reforms but also in the subtle moments of shared humanity, where a meal becomes both a pleasure and a risk, where silence speaks louder than words, and where the weight of survival rests on the simplest of acts. The high table seats that marked you for political scrutiny, imagine yourself stepping into a grand medieval hall, where the air is thick with the scent of polished wood, burning candles, and a faint trace of spiced wine from earlier feasts. This hall is no ordinary room. It is a stage upon which the delicate dance of power, loyalty, and scrutiny unfolds. At the center, the high table rises, a long, elevated platform where the most important figures gather. The seating arrangements here are far more than a matter of etiquette or tradition. They are a silent language, a carefully choreographed statement about rank, favor, and suspicion. To be seated too close to the monarch was both a privilege and a peril. Imagine the heavy eyes of courtiers fixed on you, every tilt of your head, every gesture recorded by watchful observers. Chroniclers from the time noted that a single ill-timed glance could become the spark that ignited a scandal, or worse, ended a career. The high table was not simply a place to eat or drink, it was a place where political fortunes were made and unmade, where silence could speak as loudly as words, and where one's very presence invited scrutiny. The arrangement of seats at this elevated table followed unspoken rules as rigid as stone. The monarchs sat at the center, their throne the undisputed focal point. Those closest to them enjoyed the highest honors, but also bore the weight of increased visibility. Courtiers further down the line were spared this intense gaze but were still part of the complex web of alliances and rivalries. Each seat was a symbol, a marker of one's place within the intricate hierarchy. Imagine the tactile sensation of the heavy carved chairs, their wood worn smooth by countless hands, the leather cushions slightly cracked from years of use. The table itself was often adorned with richly embroidered cloths, embossed with heraldic symbols that reinforced the power of those gathered. The shimmering glint of silverware and goblets reflected flickering candlelight, creating a dance of shadows on the stone walls. These details combined to form an atmosphere that was at once majestic and fraught with tension. The positioning at the high table dictated more than mere social standing. It shaped interactions and influenced conversation. Those seated near the monarch had to be cautious. A careless word or a moment of inattentiveness might be interpreted as a sign of disrespect or dissent. Imagine the constant mental calculation required, to appear loyal yet not obsequious, to listen attentively yet not interrupt, to show deference without seeming weak. This balancing act was a daily rhythm for many who frequented these halls. Courtiers learned to master the subtle art of eye contact, the meaning behind a slight bow, and the timing of their speech. Silence could be a tool as potent as any declaration. To be ignored or excluded from the high table was itself a message, a quiet exile that spoke of falling out of favor or political misstep. The chroniclers, those meticulous record-keepers of the court, often described moments when the entire court seemed to hold its breath. One such instance might involve a noble accidentally catching the monarch's eye at an inopportune moment, a fleeting glance that was later dissected in whispers and letters. Such a moment could ripple outward, affecting alliances and the balance of power in ways that might not be immediately visible. Consider also how the high table was a place where gossip and secrets circulated as readily as food and drink. The proximity allowed for whispered conversations, subtle glances, and coded exchanges. The seating plan made certain that potential rivals sat near each other, forcing uneasy alliances or veiled hostilities to play out beneath the veneer of civility. This was a world where every detail mattered. The very act of sitting was imbued with meaning, and the physical layout of the hall was a silent, constant reminder of one's place in the grand narrative of power. The elevated platform elevated not just bodies but the stakes of every interaction. Transitioning from the grandeur of the high table, imagine now the lives of those who served it. The stewards, the cupbearers, the cooks, whose presence was essential but whose faces were often unseen. Behind the polished wood and embroidered cloths lay a bustling, often exhausting rhythm of preparation and service. These individuals operated in the shadows of power, moving with quiet efficiency to ensure that every goblet was filled and every dish presented at precisely the right moment. Their work was itself a form of participation in the political theater. A spilled drink or a delayed meal could be interpreted as slight or sabotage. Imagine the tension behind the scenes, where the rhythm of service matched the pulse of the court's intrigues. The hands that carried platters bore not just food but the weight of expectations, the risk of being noticed or dismissed. Beyond the hall, the daily life of nobles and courtiers was shaped by the same attentiveness to status and appearance. Dressing for court involved layers of fabric and jewelry designed to project power and wealth. Walking through corridors lined with tapestries and suits of armor, one was constantly aware that every step might be observed, every conversation overheard. Imagine the quiet moments as courtiers prepared themselves for the high table, rehearsing smiles and phrases, knowing that the slightest misstep could be recorded and repeated. The very architecture of castles and palaces contributed to this atmosphere of scrutiny. Narrow hallways and small chambers ensured few moments of privacy. Yet, amid this formality, the court was also a place of genuine human interaction, with friendships, rivalries, and alliances that transcended the rigid rules of seating. Behind closed doors, the masks could slip, revealing hopes, fears, and ambitions. But the high table itself remained a stage, a constant reminder of the public face that each participant was obliged to present. Imagine yourself at the edge of this ancient hall, feeling the weight of history pressing in. The echoes of footsteps long gone, the murmur of voices no longer heard, all bound together in the silent testimony of those high table seats. These chairs, worn smooth by time, still speak of a world where power was measured not just in force but in the quiet, ever-watchful gaze of those who sat and those who watched. So, as you drift through this story, consider how even the simple act of sitting down carried meaning beyond the physical. The high table was a mirror reflecting the complexities of medieval life, where every glance, every gesture, and every seat told a story of status, suspicion, and survival within the delicate balance of power. Imagine yourself there, part of a rhythm both ancient and enduring, where history quietly whispers through the carved wood and flickering candlelight. The gilded cups that spread sickness without a word. Imagine yourself seated at a long wooden trestle table, stretching across a great hall dimly lit by flickering candles. The air is thick with the scent of roasted meats, damp stone walls, and the faint but persistent aroma of wax melting slowly from tall, slender tapers. Before you, gleaming in the low light, rests a gilded cup, its surface polished until it seems to catch the very glow of the firelight. This cup, elegant and ornate, promises a moment of refinement amid the roughness of medieval life. Yet beneath its beauty lies a hidden, silent danger. In the medieval and early modern periods, communal drinking was not just common but woven into the very fabric of social rituals. Cups, goblets, and tankards were passed hand to hand, shared between friends, family, and strangers alike. This act symbolized trust, camaraderie, and often loyalty. To refuse the shared cup was not merely a matter of personal preference, it was an insult, a rejection of the social bond. Imagine the subtle pressures of etiquette, the quiet insistence that you join the circle, raise the cup, and drink your share. But intertwined with this custom was a shadow that few could see, the invisible passage of sickness. The reality was that these shared vessels became conduits for disease. Long before the germ theory of illness was understood, people lived with an unspoken awareness that sickness could spread from one mouth to another. The polished surface of the gilded cup might deceive the eye, but it could not cleanse the invisible agents of contagion clinging to its rim. Records from various historical sources describe guests who, despite the risk, would smile politely and lift the cup to their lips, all the while dreading what might follow. It was a delicate dance between social obligation and self-preservation. Imagine the rhythm of their lives, where a simple gesture, a sip from a shared vessel, carried weight far beyond taste or refreshment. The pressure to conform often outweighed the fear of falling ill. In some households, it was a mark of honor to take the cup offered by a lord or a host, signaling respect and allegiance. To refuse was to raise questions, to disrupt the flow of communal harmony. And so, even as whispers of sickness circulated, the tradition endured, preserved by the unyielding expectations of social cohesion. The design of these drinking vessels varied across regions and classes. Nobles might sip from goblets richly adorned with gold leaf, enamel, or precious stones, while common folk used wooden or pewter tankards. Yet all shared this practice of communal drinking. In taverns and inns where travelers gathered, the sharing of cups and mugs was practical, a matter of convenience and scarcity rather than ceremony. The same cup might pass through dozens of hands in a single evening, each contact a silent transaction of trust and risk. What compounded this risk was the absence of understanding about hygiene. Water sources were often contaminated, washing utensils was irregular, and soap was a luxury. Imagine a cup passed from mouth to mouth, rarely cleaned, sometimes wiped only with a cloth that carried its own stories of use and neglect. The invisible agents of disease found easy hosts in such an environment. Illnesses such as the plague, typhoid, and various fevers spread quietly, riding the currents of human interaction and the very vessels that signified connection. At times, the consequences of this practice became tragically apparent. Entire households or communities could be struck down after gatherings where shared drinking was central. The silence around this was telling. There was no easy way to speak of contagion without breaking social bonds or inviting suspicion. So, the gilded cups continued their rounds, passing from hand to hand, carrying not just wine or ale, but an unseen burden. In some rare instances, adaptations emerged. In wealthier circles, personal cups or spoons might be introduced during meals, or attendants might serve drinks to avoid direct contact. But such measures were exceptions rather than the rule, limited by practicality and custom. The ritual of sharing, after all, was too deeply ingrained in the social fabric. Now, imagine yourself observing this scene not as a participant but as a quiet witness. The gleam of the cup, the low murmur of voices, the subtle nods of acceptance, all underscored by an unspoken tension. The knowledge of risk, held collectively but never named aloud, created a paradoxical space where safety and danger coexisted. The gilded cup became a symbol not only of hospitality but also of vulnerability. This dynamic played out not only in private halls but also in the courts of kings and queens. Royal banquets, with their grandiosity and ceremony, were no less subject to the risks of shared drinking. Protocol dictated that noble guests toast with the sovereign's cup, a mark of favor and allegiance. Yet history recounts how some courtiers would discreetly take only a sip or find ways to avoid drinking altogether, wary of the consequences. The etiquette of these moments was a careful balancing act, an intricate social choreography where every gesture carried meaning. Beyond the halls and courts, this practice offers insight into the daily struggles and complexities of historical life. The simple act of drinking was a social performance shaped by customs, hierarchy, and health concerns. It was a constant struggle between the desire for belonging and the need for survival. As you let these images settle, the flickering candlelight on the gilded cup, the murmur of guests, the invisible passage of illness, consider how much of history is woven from such subtle moments. Not from grand battles or sweeping events alone, but from the quiet exchanges that shaped human connection and its delicate balance with the unseen threats that accompanied it. The gilded cups remind us that every ritual, no matter how refined or beautiful, carries layers of meaning and consequence. They speak of a world where trust was literal, shared by passing a vessel from one hand to another, and where that trust was both a blessing and a risk. And in that gentle rhythm, the past reaches out, inviting us to reflect on how much we inherit from those who lived with such complexities. So next time you hold a cup, imagine the long line of hands that might have once grasped it, the stories contained within its curve, and the silent risks taken for the sake of belonging. In that quiet reflection, history becomes not a distant tale, but a shared experience, one that connects us across time through the simple act of drinking together. The feast hall fires that smothered guests in smoke. Imagine yourself stepping into a grand medieval feast hall, its walls lined with tapestries depicting legendary battles and noble ancestors, flickering gently in the warm light of countless candles and torches. The hall is vast, its high-vaulted ceilings soaring above, designed to impress visitors and affirm the wealth and status of its lord. At one end, a massive stone fireplace dominates the space, its hearth roaring with a fire that crackles and dances, sending tongues of amber light spilling over the faces of the gathered guests. This fireplace, like many in the great halls of medieval castles and manor houses, was more than a source of warmth. It was a symbol of abundance and hospitality. The ability to maintain such a blaze in the heart of the hall spoke of resources and comfort. Yet, beneath this comforting glow lurked a less pleasant truth. The technology of the time had not yet mastered efficient ventilation. The thick smoke produced by the burning wood, rich with the scent of resin and char, often lingered heavily in the air, clouding the feast in a slow, creeping haze. Imagine the guests seated at long wooden tables, their faces intermittently obscured by wisps of smoke that rise and drift lazily toward the rafters. The air is dense, slightly acrid, and filled with the faintest hint of soot. Despite this, leaving the table was not a simple matter. To rise and excuse oneself mid-meal could be interpreted as a breach of etiquette, a subtle insult to the host's generosity. So, the guests endure, quiet coughs occasionally punctuating the soft murmur of conversation, their throats raw from the persistent haze. The hall's construction contributed to this smoky environment. Large though it was, the space was often enclosed tightly to conserve heat during the colder months. Windows were small and few, allowing just slivers of pale light to seep in during the day, and at night, only the flicker of flames provided illumination. Smoke, unable to escape efficiently through chimneys or vents, settled in the corners and hovered near the ceiling, descending slowly to mingle with the warm breath of the assembled company. Historical accounts and chronicles from the period frequently mention this phenomenon, though often in passing, as a commonplace inconvenience rather than a dire problem. Guests were expected to tolerate the discomfort as part of the experience of attending a noble's feast. The endurance of smoky air was woven into the fabric of social gatherings, a reminder that luxury and hardship often walked hand in hand. Consider the practical challenges faced by the keepers of the hall. The fire needed to burn steadily, both to heat the vast stone chamber and to provide light after dusk. The logs, often resinous woods like pine, were chosen for their bright flames and crackling qualities but produced thick, persistent smoke. Attempts to mitigate this, such as raising the hearth or adding simple smoke vents, were limited by the architectural styles and construction techniques of the time. Guests, mindful of social expectations, adapted their behaviors. Some would hold their breath briefly as the smoke surged, others turned their heads away, trying to catch a clear breath between bouts of coughing. It was a quiet struggle, a shared but unspoken discomfort that knit the company together in a subtle way. The rhythm of the feast was marked not only by the arrival of dishes but by the slow ebb and flow of the smoky haze. This tension between warmth and suffocation also reveals a broader contrast in medieval life. The grand halls were spaces of celebration and ceremony, yet they were constrained by practical realities that could never quite be fully overcome. The opulence of a roaring fire was tempered by the invisible cost borne by the guests, their lungs absorbing tiny particles that would irritate and wear over time. At the same time, the smoky atmosphere lent the hall an almost otherworldly quality. The dance of firelight and shadow, softened by the curling tendrils of smoke, created a scene reminiscent of candlelit paintings. It drew attention to faces, gestures, and the gleam of polished utensils, while also blurring edges and muffling sounds, inviting a quiet, contemplative mood. It was as if the smoke wrapped the feast in a protective veil, both obscuring and revealing the nuances of courtly life. Stepping back to consider this daily reality, one can see how such environmental conditions shaped social customs and interactions. The polite endurance of smoke became an implicit expectation, a mark of decorum and respect. It was a reminder that hospitality demanded patience, that to partake in the abundance of the Lord's table was to accept, however reluctantly, certain discomforts. Moreover, this experience connects to the sensory world of the medieval period in subtle ways. The thick air, scented faintly with wood smoke and mingling with the aromas of roasting meats and spiced wines, enveloped the guests in a complex tapestry of smells and sensations. The warmth against chilled skin, the rough texture of wooden benches, the occasional crackle of burning logs, all combined to immerse one fully in the moment, even as the smoke whispered reminders of the hall's imperfect nature. As the meal progressed, guests shifted slightly, seeking pockets of clearer air or adjusting their posture to minimize the impact of the smoke. Yet, the unspoken rule held firm. The meal continued, the conversation flowed, and no one dared break the fragile etiquette by withdrawing early. This quiet endurance speaks to the rhythms of medieval social life, where appearances and manners held profound weight, often shaping behavior as much as personal comfort. It is worth reflecting on how modern comforts have transformed such experiences. Today, ventilation systems and air circulation are taken for granted, allowing gatherings to proceed free from such persistent discomfort. The smoky halls of the past remind us that even the most majestic settings carried their own constraints, that history's luxury was often mingled with challenge. In imagining yourself seated in one of these halls, surrounded by the muted murmur of voices, the flickering glow of firelight, and the steady rise of smoke curling toward the ceiling, you can sense the layered textures of medieval life. There is a tangible tension between celebration and endurance, between the warmth that invites and the haze that constricts. This balance, subtle and persistent, is a constant thread woven into the fabric of the feast hall experience. So, as you drift through this memory of the past, consider the guests who sat quietly, their coughs subdued, their discomfort veiled beneath polite smiles. They navigated a delicate dance, where the fire's glow was both a beacon of welcome and a reminder of the inevitable presence of smoke. Their stories, etched softly in chronicles and whispered in the folds of history, invite you to witness the complex interplay of comfort and constraint, of ritual and reality that defined the great halls of medieval times. The performers who spoke in riddles that could trap you. Imagine yourself stepping into a grand medieval hall, the air thick with the mingled scents of beeswax candles, roasting meats, and worn timber. The chatter of guests fills the space with a steady hum, punctuated by bursts of laughter or the clink of goblets. At the far end, near the raised dais, stands the performer, a minstrel or jester, dressed in colorful, motley garments that catch the flickering firelight. Their role, however, extends far beyond mere entertainment. In this delicate dance of words and gestures, these performers wielded riddles and veiled songs not simply to amuse, but to test the loyalties and wits of their audience. In the medieval world, where power and influence shifted as easily as the seasons, trust was a precious commodity. Lords and ladies entertained carefully chosen guests, and every smile, every glance, every laugh was potentially laden with meaning. The performer, seemingly a harmless purveyor of joy, was often an instrument of subtle surveillance. Their riddles and verses could carry concealed critiques or hints that only the keenest listeners might decipher. Imagine the weight of that moment. A jester's playful ballad suddenly turns sharp, an allegory aimed at someone in the hall. The slightest sign of recognition, a twitch of a smile or a stifled chuckle, could be remembered, noted, and later recounted to the lord or lady presiding over the feast. These performances were not always overtly malicious, but they required careful attention. Guests quickly learned that it was safer to watch the room, the walls, or the flickering firelight, rather than meet the performer's eyes directly. The performer's riddles were like a net cast wide, ensnaring those who revealed too much or showed themselves vulnerable. It was a game of subtlety, a test of social intelligence. The performer's role was both entertainer and observer, weaving entertainment and espionage into a seamless whole. Consider the nature of these riddles: words wrapped in metaphors, phrases folded into layers of meaning. A jest about a rotten apple might hint at a traitor in the court. A song about cold winds could allude to an approaching threat or unrest. These veiled messages required the audience to listen closely, to parse the words carefully. Yet openly reacting was dangerous. To laugh, nod, or frown could betray one's stance or secret knowledge. The walls themselves, silent witnesses to countless gatherings, seemed to absorb the unspoken tension as much as the spoken words. The tradition of using performance as a means of testing loyalty or spreading information traces back even further. Traveling minstrels were often the eyes and ears of distant lords, carrying news from faraway places while gauging the mood of each court they visited. Their songs and tales might include subtle signals or warnings for those who knew how to listen. In some cases, jesters were even sworn servants of powerful patrons, their sharp tongues allowed to speak truths veiled in humor, delivering messages that no other courtier dared voice aloud. Imagine the layers of awareness required to navigate such an environment. A guest must enjoy the performance enough to avoid suspicion but remain guarded enough not to reveal thoughts. A careless reaction was not just embarrassing, it could be perilous. Stories passed down in chronicles and letters describe courtiers who found themselves suddenly out of favor or even imprisoned after a performer's seemingly innocuous jest was interpreted as an insult or a sign of disloyalty. These entertainers held a peculiar position, neither fully servants nor nobles, yet able to move freely between ranks. Their presence was a reminder that the boundaries between amusement and danger were thin. Guests learned to read not just the words but the silences, the pauses, the shifts in tone. The performer's eyes, always bright and sharp, scanned the room, picking up on every subtle cue. In this silent exchange, trust and suspicion intertwined. the walls of the Great Hall seemed to whisper secrets of these encounters. Imagine the centuries of stories embedded in their stones, the unspoken communications, the glances that passed like shadows, the riddles that danced on the edge of understanding. In these moments, the rhythm of medieval life pulsed not only in grand gestures but in small, guarded interactions. Behind the colorful costumes and lively tunes, these performers shaped the social fabric of the court. Their riddles were more than entertainment. They were tools of influence and control, subtle instruments that maintained the delicate balance of power. In a world where open confrontation was dangerous, words cloaked in mystery and melody became a safer means of probing alliances and testing the waters. As the firelight flickers low and the last notes of a song drift into silence, the hall exhales a collective breath. Guests return their attention to their plates and companions, careful not to betray their thoughts. The performer steps back, blending once more into the shadows, their role complete until the next gathering. Imagine yourself among these guests, sensing the weight of every word, feeling the constant struggle to navigate a world where even laughter could be a trap. This subtle art of veiled communication through performance reminds us how human interaction, even in times long past, carried layers of meaning beneath the surface. The performers who spoke in riddles were more than entertainers. They were silent arbiters of trust, wielding their craft to influence, to reveal, and sometimes to ensnare. And so, within the walls of the medieval hall, beneath the surface of song and jest, a quiet game of shadows played on, a rhythm as steady and ancient as the stones themselves. The servants who memorized every whispered confession. Imagine yourself in the dimly lit corridors behind a grand medieval banquet hall, where shadows dance softly along stone walls heavy with the scent of burning tallow and aged timber. Beyond the clamor of laughter and clinking goblets, a quieter world unfolds, one of subtle movements and hushed tones. Here, the servants move like ghosts, faces composed, eyes alert, ears keen. Their presence is meant to be invisible, blending seamlessly into the background, yet they bear a responsibility far heavier than carrying trays or lighting candles. They are the silent witnesses to whispered confessions and secret bargains, memorizing every murmured word exchanged between the noble guests seated above. In the world of medieval courts and manors, trust was a commodity traded with great care, and privacy was a fragile illusion. Banquets were more than mere meals. They were stages for political maneuvering, alliance forging, and discreet negotiations. Imagine the noble lords and ladies seated in stately procession, their voices dipping low as delicate courses are served, their conversations veiled in shadows and half-words. These whispered exchanges, often shielded from the ears of rivals, contained promises, threats, and revelations that shaped the fate of realms and families. Yet, the lords themselves rarely had eyes and ears enough to catch every nuance, so the watchful servants played a crucial role. These servants were more than attendants. They were living repositories of sensitive information. Their training was not written but learned through keen observation, discretion, and an extraordinary capacity for memory. Imagine the strain and subtle tension as they balanced the demands of their duties with the imperative to listen carefully and remember, for the smallest slip could endanger lives or unravel carefully laid plans. Chroniclers from the era often remarked on the remarkable skill of these servants, who, despite their lowly station, wielded an unexpected power. They collected whispers like precious gems, storing secrets in their minds as securely as the Lord kept his treasures in chests. Some servants became trusted confidants, summoned later to the Lord's private chamber to recount conversations overheard during the feast. The accuracy of these recollections could tip the scales in political intrigues, expose plots, or affirm loyalties. The burden on these servants was immense. Imagine the mental discipline required to sift through layers of conversation, distinguishing truths from deception, friendly words from veiled insults, while maintaining a composed exterior. Their very survival depended on their ability to navigate the complex social webs that defined noble households. A misstep, an ill-timed disclosure, or a hint of disloyalty could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse. This delicate balance made servants both indispensable and precariously positioned. They occupied a space where invisibility was safety, but knowledge was power. The whispering halls of the banquet became arenas not only of public display but of covert intelligence gathering, where silence and speech were weaponized in equal measure. The role of these servants illuminates the rhythm of medieval court life, an existence woven with intrigue and careful performance. Beyond the grandeur and ceremony, beneath layers of protocol and etiquette, pulses a current of cautious observation and guarded communication. The servants, ever watchful, became the invisible threads connecting conversations, secrets, and decisions that shaped the fates of nobles and nations. It is important to see these servants not merely as passive observers but as active participants in this intricate dance. Their memories served as records in an age before widespread literacy and formalized communication networks. By silently absorbing whispered confessions and promises, they became living archives, bridging the gap between spoken word and recorded history. Imagine, then, the moments after the banquet, when the guests have departed and the hall falls silent. The servants gather quietly, their minds replaying conversations as they prepare to deliver their careful reports. The Lord's chamber becomes a stage for the transmission of this hidden knowledge, where the power of spoken words is magnified through memory and trust. This practice also reflects the broader social structures of the time, where hierarchy and secrecy governed interactions, and information was both currency and weapon. Servants who mastered the art of listening and recalling could find themselves indispensable, their loyalty rewarded with favor or advancement. Yet this closeness to power was fraught with risk, for they navigated a world where alliances shifted and truths were often half-told. The echoes of these whispered confessions remind us that history is often shaped not only by kings and nobles but by those who move quietly in their shadows. The servants' silent vigil preserved stories otherwise lost, their memories threading together the fabric of medieval power and intrigue. As you imagine yourself stepping away from the bustling banquet hall into the quiet, shadowed passages where these servants worked, consider the invisible weight they carried. Every whisper, every secret bargain memorized, was a stitch in the tapestry of history, a reminder that even in the grandest settings, the smallest voices may hold the greatest significance. The unseen drafts that turned feasts into chilling ordeals. Imagine yourself entering a vast medieval great hall just as dusk begins to settle, the last light slipping away and the chill of evening creeping slowly over the stone floors. The walls, thick and ancient, carry with them the memory of the day's heat, stored deep within their granite bones, only to release it slowly as a cold breath that drifts through the air. These drafts, unseen yet insistent, shaped the very experience of feasts, turning what should have been celebrations into subtle ordeals of endurance. The stone walls, absorbing warmth from the sun through the day, became silent reservoirs of cold once night fell. Imagine the sensation. As you take your seat, the air seems to press against your skin like a gentle but unrelenting tide of coolness. The nobles who arrived late, often after hours of travel or waiting, found themselves caught unprepared for this creeping chill. Their finely woven garments, though richly adorned, offered little defense against the cold that pooled around the edges of the hall and slipped beneath heavy tapestries. Picture the nobles shifting uneasily, fingers clasped tightly, breath visible in the frigid air, yet all of this discomfort masked beneath masks of composed elegance. The expectation was clear: maintain perfect posture, perfect decorum, as if the cold did not seep into the bones or distract from the performance of status. The slightest shiver was a sign of weakness, a crack in the polished facade that invited scrutiny from those seated nearby. This was no mere inconvenience. The chill seemed to sharpen senses, heightening the awareness of the room's atmosphere. The muted rustle of velvet gowns, the faint clink of silver goblets, the whispered exchange of cautious glances. Imagine the slow creep of cold along the backs of necks and across bare wrists as the evening dragged on, a constant reminder that comfort was subordinate to appearance. The very architecture of these halls contributed to this phenomenon. Massive fireplaces, though roaring, could not always chase away the drafts that slipped through the high windows or ancient doorways. Tapestries, hung not only for decoration but to block wind and cold, sometimes shifted with hidden currents, adding to the eerie sensation of invisible breath moving through the room. Imagine the servants moving quietly, their footsteps muffled by rushes strewn on the stone floors, their hands quick to adjust tapestries or tend to the fires. Yet even their efforts could not fully banish the unseen drafts that seemed woven into the very fabric of the great hall. The cold was as much a part of the feast as the food and drink, a silent participant in the evening's drama. For those who arrived late, the cold was a kind of trial, a test of endurance and discretion. They might hide behind a shield of formal greetings, smile through teeth that felt numb, and swallow hot drinks meant to stave off shivers. Their discomfort became a whispered secret, understood by all but never acknowledged aloud, for to admit such vulnerability was to undermine one's standing. Beyond the physical chill, the drafts added a layer of psychological tension to the gathering. Imagine the feeling of isolation even within a crowded room, the cold a subtle barrier that made warmth and camaraderie harder to reach. The nobles, each wrapped in their own armor of finery and pride, confronted not only the scrutiny of their peers but the elemental chill that stripped away ease and familiarity. This unseen cold shaped the rhythm of the feast, dictating pauses between courses, influencing the flow of conversation, and marking time in subtle ways. As the evening wore on, the drafts became part of the memory of the gathering, a whispered reminder of the limits of comfort and the constant vigilance demanded by life in these halls. Imagine yourself there, feeling the slow seep of cold through the fabric of your fine garments, the hush of conversation punctuated by polite coughs and the faint sound of shifting feet. The warmth of the hearth feels distant, a flickering promise rather than a steady comfort. The stone walls, ancient and unyielding, hold onto their cold as surely as they do the secrets of every feast, every whispered word, every glance cast in the dim candlelight. In this way, the unseen drafts transformed the grand feasts into experiences of endurance, quiet trials that tested not just the body, but the very spirit of those who gathered to claim their place at the table. Imagine how such subtle discomforts shaped the unspoken rituals of power and presence, where even the cold was another player in the delicate dance of status and survival. The carved faces that watched from high gallery beams, imagine yourself stepping into a grand medieval hall, where the air is cool and carries the faint scent of aged timber and lingering incense. Your eyes are drawn upward, beyond the flicker of candlelight and the clatter of footsteps, to the high wooden beams that stretch across the ceiling. There, carved faces peer silently down upon you, some serene angels with gentle expressions, others twisted grotesques, their features exaggerated into uncanny visages. These carvings are more than mere decoration. They serve as silent sentinels in the architecture, watching over every gathering beneath. In many medieval halls, these carved figures held symbolic and practical significance. The wooden beams were often adorned with images intended to remind guests of moral codes, divine presence, or the watchful eyes of authority. Imagine the subtle power these faces held, fixed, unblinking, immortalized in wood, silently observing every gesture, every word spoken in the hall below. For those attending feasts or assemblies, the presence of these carvings was far from passive. Chronicles and personal accounts from the period reveal that many guests felt a tangible pressure under these silent gazes. The belief that the carved faces were watching for dishonesty or impropriety created an atmosphere of heightened awareness. Imagine yourself seated at the long table, the murmur of voices hushed slightly as the crowd senses the watchful eyes above. Appetite often waned, not from any physical cause, but from a quiet discomfort, a sense that every action might be noted and judged. The choice of imagery in these carvings was deliberate. Angels symbolized divine oversight and protection, reinforcing the presence of a higher moral order even amid earthly festivities. Grotesques, on the other hand, embodied warnings, reminders of folly or vice. Their exaggerated features, sometimes blending human and animal traits, evoked unease and served as silent admonitions against transgression. Imagine the interplay of these figures across a hall's beams, a constant tension between grace and warning, comfort and caution. These carvings also reflected the social dynamics at play. In an era when honor and reputation were paramount, the idea of being watched, even by stone or wood, added a layer of social control. Guests were reminded that deceit, gossip, or misbehavior could carry consequences beyond the immediate moment. The silent faces symbolized the invisible eyes of peers, rulers, or even divine judgment. Crafting such carvings required skilled artisans who combined artistry with symbolism. Each face, whether angelic or grotesque, was shaped with intent, carved to capture emotion or convey meaning that transcended words. The wood itself, aged and darkened by time, seemed to lend a presence to these figures, as if they might at any moment shift from mere decoration to active witness. Imagine the contrast between the warm, bustling activity below and the stillness of those faces high above, unmoved by laughter, silence, or whispered secrets. They formed an enduring presence, part guardian, part admonisher, part mystery, that colored the experience of every gathering beneath them. Over time, these carved faces became part of the hall's identity. Visitors would speak of the watchers, in hushed tones, some feeling comforted by their presence, others unsettled. The shared understanding that these silent sentinels observed all fostered a subtle tension, blending tradition, superstition, and social expectation. Beyond their immediate function, these carvings invite reflection on how architecture and art shape human behavior and experience. Imagine how the mere presence of those faces influenced conduct, manners, and even the atmosphere of trust or suspicion during a meal or council. They remind us that spaces are never neutral. They carry stories, meanings, and unseen forces that guide the rhythms of daily life. So as you picture the carved faces looking down from high gallery beams, consider the quiet power they held, watching without judgment, yet shaping the very way people behaved under their gaze. In their stillness lies a rich tapestry of history, where art, belief, and social order intertwine softly, like the gentle creak of timber in a great hall at dusk. The endless toasts that left no option but compliance. Imagine yourself seated at a long banquet table beneath towering chandeliers, their candle flames flickering gently, casting a warm glow over the richly embroidered garments and polished goblets. Around you, voices rise in measured cadence, as the host stands to proclaim yet another toast. In this world of ritual and hierarchy, every announcement demands attention, every declaration is an occasion for celebration, or at least appearance of celebration. At these grand medieval banquets, toasting was not merely a gesture of goodwill. It was a ritual bound by expectation and social obligation. Imagine the guests rising one after another, lifting their goblets with careful precision, their faces poised between the effort of performance and the fatigue quietly settling in. The rhythm of these toasts could stretch on endlessly, each new pronouncement calling for another rise, another drink, another moment in the spotlight. The toll this ritual took was subtle but unmistakable. Chroniclers of the time, in their careful records, hint at the weariness that crept into these gatherings, not just physical exhaustion, but a tension that wrapped around the guests like a quiet fog. To refuse a toast, to remain seated while others stood, was more than a simple breach of manners. It was a statement, a spark that could ignite suspicion or gossip. The social fabric of the banquet was woven tightly, and compliance was its thread. Imagine the apprehension flickering behind polite smiles. Each time a cup was raised, guests weighed the cost, the warmth of the drink spreading slowly through their bodies, the tightening grip of fatigue, the careful balance of appearing enthusiastic without succumbing to excess. The room filled with the soft clink of goblets and murmured acknowledgments, masking the inner struggle of those who longed to decline but dared not. This ritual was deeply entwined with the politics of power and alliance. To participate fully in the toasts was to affirm loyalty and goodwill, to publicly align oneself with the host and their ambitions. To abstain, even briefly, risked whispers of dissent or disrespect. The stakes were unspoken but high, woven into the very etiquette of the feast. Consider the drinks themselves, often rich, sometimes spiced wines or alesh, served in goblets of silver or finely crafted wood. The flavors were varied, the textures warm and inviting, yet for some guests, the steady succession of cups blurred into a numbing repetition. The very act of raising a glass, repeated again and again, transformed from a gesture of celebration into a performance of endurance. The length of these banquets added to the strain. Feasts could last for hours, moving through courses of roasted meats, breads, cheeses, and sweets, each accompanied by another series of toasts. The guests, clad in their finest, balanced on the edge of social grace and bodily weariness, their expressions carefully maintained even as their limbs grew heavy. This relentless sequence of toasts also carried an undercurrent of psychological pressure. The collective expectation to participate, to be seen raising one's cup in harmony with the group, created a subtle coercion. The act of compliance became a ritualized form of social control, binding individuals to the group through shared gestures and repeated affirmations. Yet, within this seemingly uniform pattern, there was room for nuance. Some guests mastered the art of discreet moderation, sipping just enough to appear engaged while guarding their own limits. Others relied on practiced smiles or subtle gestures to navigate the unspoken demands. Still, the risk of misstep lingered, a quiet threat beneath the surface of cordiality. Reflecting on this, we see how the simple act of toasting was never truly simple. It was a dance of appearances, a careful negotiation between personal comfort and social expectation. The endless toasts mapped the rhythm of medieval feasting as much as the music and conversation did, shaping the atmosphere with a steady pulse of obligation. Imagine now the final toast, the last cup lifted in unison, signaling the close of the evening. Relief mingled with lingering fatigue, and guests settled back into their seats, their bodies heavy but their expressions composed. The banquet had fulfilled its purpose, a display of unity, allegiance, and ritual compliance, yet beneath the surface, the echoes of those countless raised glasses lingered, a testament to the complex interplay of power and performance. In recalling these scenes, you glimpse the subtle challenges faced by those who navigated the grand halls of the past. The endless toasts were more than ceremony, they were a constant reminder that in such spaces, to comply was to survive socially, and to resist was to risk isolation. The shared endurance of this ritual speaks to the intricate layers of medieval social life, where every gesture carried weight, and every cup demanded participation. The shared trencher bread that revealed one's place. Imagine yourself seated at a long wooden table in a bustling medieval hall. The air carries the mingled aromas of roasted meats, spiced stews, and freshly baked bread, thick with the warmth of the hearth. Before you lies a simple, yet essential part of the meal, a trencher. Unlike the plates we know today, this was not a ceramic dish, but a thick slab of coarse bread, sturdy enough to hold rich sauces and hearty cuts, yet porous enough to soak in every drop of flavor. This shared trencher bread was much more than a humble eating vessel. It was a silent indicator of one's place in the social order, a daily reminder woven into the very fabric of communal dining. In these times, tableware as we understand it was a luxury reserved for the wealthiest. Instead, trenchers served as edible plates, and their use revealed subtle but clear distinctions. The highest-ranking guests at a feast were granted fresh trenchers, warm and intact, their edges crisp and inviting. These fresh trenchers were a privilege, symbols of honor and favor. To receive one was to be acknowledged as part of the inner circle, someone deserving of respect and esteem. For others, the experience was markedly different. After a guest finished their meal, their trencher, soaked with the juices and crumbs of their food, was often passed down the table to those of lower status. These reused trenchers, softened and saturated, became the plates of servants, retainers, and those lower in the social hierarchy. It was an accepted custom, and though it might seem unappetizing to modern sensibilities, those who received the second or even third usage of trenchers understood their place in the social structure without question. The act of passing trenchers carried an unspoken message. No words were needed to express the order of precedence. It was written clearly in the condition of the bread beneath each guest's meal. This silent display was an everyday ritual of hierarchy, played out not only through seating arrangements or the choice of dishes but in the very bread that held the feast. Imagine the texture. The crisp edges of a fresh trencher contrasted against the sodden softness of one already bearing the impressions of another's appetite. Each bite, each crumb, was layered with meaning. Records and chronicles from the period often note the care with which these customs were observed. Those of high birth or position could expect the freshest offerings, while others accepted their portions with quiet grace. Refusal was rarely an option. To reject a past trencher could be interpreted as an insult or a challenge, disrupting the delicate social balance that kept the feast harmonious. Guests understood that their acceptance was a mark of respect as much as submission. This practice also reveals much about the rhythm of medieval daily life, the economy of resources, the communal nature of meals, and the importance of status. Bread was a staple food, nourishing and plentiful, yet here it served as a social marker, illustrating how even the most basic elements of sustenance carried layers of meaning. The trencher was at once a practical utensil and a symbol of one's standing, quietly affirming the invisible lines that separated lord from servant, noble from commoner. Beyond the social implications, imagine the sensory experience of this shared bread. The aroma of freshly baked loaves mingled with the savory scent of meat juices soaking into the crumb. The rough texture of the bread beneath your fingers, the slight dampness where the gravy had pooled, the taste of stale crumbs mingling with lingering flavors from another's meal, each sensation tied to a story of communal survival and unspoken rules. As you sit in this medieval hall, picture the shifting dynamics around the table. Conversations murmur in the background. The crackle of the fire blends with the scrape of wooden utensils on trenchers. The bread, once fresh and firm, now softened and marked by use, moves slowly down the table in a ritual both practical and symbolic. Through this shared trencher bread, guests were reminded, meal by meal, of their place in the world they inhabited, a world where every detail, even the bread beneath their food, spoke volumes without uttering a single word. This quiet, unassuming practice reflects the intricate web of status and survival that shaped medieval society. The trencher bread was more than sustenance. It was a mirror of rank, a symbol of acceptance, and a testament to the enduring human impulse to find meaning in the everyday. And so, within the humble crust of shared bread, the rhythm of medieval life continued its steady, enduring beat. The wall niches that hid guards ready to intervene. Imagine yourself stepping quietly into a vast medieval hall, where sunlight filters through narrow windows, casting soft patterns across stone floors worn smooth by countless footsteps. Along the walls, rich tapestries hang heavy, their woven scenes depicting battles, hunts, or mythic tales. Yet behind these grand decorations lies a secret less often seen, a network of hidden recesses carved deep into the thick stone, niches just large enough to conceal a figure waiting silently, unseen by the casual eye. These wall niches served a critical and discreet purpose. Behind the ornamental tapestries or intricately carved wooden screens, loyal retainers, trusted guards, stood ready, poised to intervene should any guest cross the delicate boundaries of hospitality or etiquette. Imagine the quiet tension as these sentinels blended into the shadows, their presence a silent reminder that beneath the polished surface of noble gatherings, vigilance was constant and unyielding. The role of these hidden guards was both protective and political. In an era when honor and reputation could be threatened by a careless word or bold action, a host's control over their domain extended beyond mere welcome and good manners. Guests, even the most powerful nobles, were reminded subtly that respect was expected, and that the walls themselves might be watching. This created an atmosphere where voices lowered instinctively, conversations were measured, and actions carefully weighed. Historians and chroniclers have noted that such architectural features were not uncommon in castles and manor houses, especially those belonging to rulers wary of intrigue or rebellion. These niches, often overlooked in modern tours, were built with purpose, concealed alcoves where guards could observe discreetly, listen carefully, and, if necessary, step forward swiftly to enforce the host's will. Picture the retainer within, motionless yet alert, the weight of a concealed weapon resting at their side. Their instructions were clear: maintain order, protect the honor of the household, and remove anyone whose behavior threatened peace or challenged authority. The removal need not always be violent. Often it meant a firm word or an escort to the door, but the presence of such guardians underscored the thin line between civility and conflict. For guests unaware of these hidden figures, the uncertainty added a layer of psychological complexity. Imagine speaking softly, mindful not only of those present but of unseen eyes and ears. The knowledge, sometimes whispered in hushed rumors, sometimes a well-kept secret, that the walls might conceal vigilant watchers made every word carry weight. This atmosphere bred a caution that permeated conversations and gestures alike. Beyond security, these niches and their occupants reflected the rhythms of medieval power dynamics. Hospitality was a performance as much as a courtesy. It demanded control, display, and sometimes discreet enforcement. The walls were not just passive stone and timber but active participants in the social order, channels through which authority was silently projected. The presence of hidden guards also reveals the underlying fragility of trust in noble circles. Despite the outward grandeur and ceremonies, suspicion often simmered beneath. Guests might be allies or rivals, friends or foes, and the host's vigilance was a safeguard against betrayal or insult. The walls, in their stillness, became silent sentinels of loyalty and order. Consider, too, the craftsmanship involved in creating these niches. Carved so precisely as to escape notice, integrated seamlessly into the architecture, their concealment a marvel of design and intention. They were functional art, blending form and purpose in service of protection. As you imagine yourself walking along those halls, the rich textures of tapestries brushing softly in the draft, the muted murmur of voices drifting in the distance, remember the hidden presence behind the scenes. The niches and their vigilant occupants remind us that medieval gatherings, while outwardly elegant and refined, were also arenas of subtle power plays and guarded interactions. In this way, the wall niches that hid guards ready to intervene offer a glimpse into a world where silence was loaded with meaning, where the boundary between guest and intruder was carefully policed, and where the very stones seemed to watch. It is a reminder that history often hides in the spaces between light and shadow, in the quiet recesses where watchful eyes wait patiently, unseen but ever present. The chilled galleries where lesser nobles were exiled. Imagine yourself stepping away from the glowing warmth of the central Great Hall, where the favored nobles gather beneath chandeliers flickering with candlelight. Beyond the bustling center, narrow galleries stretch along the stone walls, long, slender corridors where shadows pool, and the air carries a persistent chill. These were the spaces reserved not for the most honored, but for the lesser nobles, those who were present but not quite welcome. The galleries, often constructed as narrow passageways lined with cold stone and small, shuttered windows, lacked the comforting hearths and broad tapestries of the main hall. Imagine the subtle echo of footsteps against the bare floors, the faint rustle of heavy cloaks drawn tight against the chill. The atmosphere here was quieter, not just in sound, but in spirit. These spaces were designed to separate, to mark distinction through exclusion. While the central hall thrummed with conversation, laughter, and the clinking of goblets, the galleries held a different rhythm. Here, voices were muted, gestures reserved. The cold air seemed to press in, making every breath visible, every movement deliberate. Nobles seated here were acutely aware of their marginal status, each glance toward the brightly lit center a reminder of favor withheld. Chroniclers of the time recorded the quiet resentment that took root in these shadowed corners. Imagine the suppressed frustration as guests wrapped their fingers around goblets, not just to drink but to warm their hands, their eyes flicking toward the warmth they were denied. This chill was more than physical. It was a social frost that crept slowly through the bones, seeping into the mood and mind. The isolation was palpable. Though surrounded by peers, those exiled to the galleries dined with a sense of separation, as if set apart not only by space but by rank and influence. The narrowness of the galleries forced a closer proximity, but the cold seemed to draw invisible lines between the guests, erecting walls more effective than stone. The very design of these spaces served as a statement. They were visible yet remote, part of the feast yet apart from its heart. Imagine the frustration mingling with the chill, how every whispered conversation might carry the weight of unspoken grievances, how the shadows could harbor glances sharp with envy or silent plotting. Despite the cold and seclusion, these nobles were not powerless. The galleries became crucibles of quiet dissent and careful alliance building. Imagine hushed voices exchanging cautious words, the slow weaving of plans in the dim light, as those overlooked sought ways to reclaim warmth and standing. Serving these spaces was a task that required discretion. Stewards and servers moved swiftly but silently, mindful of the delicate tensions in the air. The food and drink, though similar to that of the central hall, might have lacked the lavish presentation or immediacy, reinforcing the sense of distance. Yet, even within this chill and exile, life continued. The nobles adapted, drawing on layers of rich fabric and consuming hot spice drinks to stave off the cold. Imagine the ritual of passing warmth hand to hand, the fleeting comfort found in small gatherings, the shared acknowledgement of being on the periphery of power. This separation was not merely a physical reality but a reflection of the intricate social hierarchies that governed medieval life. The cold galleries, though less visible, were as much a stage as the high table, where status was performed and contested in subtler ways. Imagine the weight of silence here, heavy as stone, punctuated by the occasional clink of a cup or the low murmur of a confidant. As you picture these chilled galleries, consider the contrast they created. A feast divided not just by food and drink, but by warmth and cold, inclusion and exclusion, light and shadow. The nobles here were exiled not by distance alone but by the invisible walls of favor and disdain, their presence a reminder that power is as much about who sits near the fire as who is left shivering in the shadows. So, as the night deepened and the great hall's glow cast long shadows, the galleries held their own stories, of quiet endurance, simmering resentment, and the subtle, unyielding dance of medieval social order. Imagine yourself there, wrapped against the cold, part of a gathering both present and apart, where every breath forms a cloud in the chill air, and the warmth of power feels just beyond reach. The ritual of forced revelry that few enjoyed. Imagine yourself seated in a grand medieval hall, the flickering glow of candlelight casting dancing shadows upon stone walls draped with rich tapestries. The evening's festivities have long since begun, and yet, the hours stretch onward, deep into the night. Around you, guests are expected to embody an unyielding cheerfulness, applauding with vigor after each performance, their smiles carefully maintained despite the heavy weight of exhaustion pressing upon them. This was the ritual of forced revelry, a social expectation deeply embedded in the customs of medieval and early modern gatherings. Imagine the subtle, almost imperceptible tension beneath the surface, the polite laughter that masks weariness, the measured clapping that conceals fading spirits. Guests were bound by unwritten codes to remain lively and engaged, long after their bodies yearned for rest. Historical records and chronicles reveal the quiet regrets of those who endured these nights. Many confided, often in private, that they wished they could slip away earlier, to retreat from the relentless gaiety into solitude or quiet chambers. Yet, to do so was fraught with peril for one's reputation. Leaving prematurely was often interpreted as rudeness, disinterest, or worse, an insult to the host's generosity and status. Imagine the careful balancing act each guest performed, managing fatigue and social obligation, personal comfort and public expectation. The performances themselves were varied, musicians strumming lutes and harps, minstrels weaving tales, jesters juggling or reciting verse. Each act was designed not only to entertain but to reinforce social bonds and hierarchies. Applause and laughter were currency, demonstrations of loyalty and approval that echoed far beyond the hall's stone walls. Yet the applause was often more ritual than genuine enthusiasm, a communal act of endurance as much as enjoyment. Picture the scene. A noblewoman's hand poised mid-clap, her smile steady though her eyes reveal a quiet weariness. A courtier's head inclined respectfully toward the performer, all the while counting the minutes until he might withdraw unnoticed. The rhythm of the evening was dictated not by comfort but by convention, an unspoken agreement that revelry must continue, no matter the cost. This expectation extended beyond the mere duration of the festivities. The mood had to be consistently bright and animated. Moments of silence or visible fatigue risked attracting unwanted attention or suspicion. In this way, the ritual enforced a particular social performance, one where emotional expression was carefully curated and inner exhaustion hidden beneath layers of decorum. For hosts, the forced revelry was a matter of pride and power. The ability to hold a gathering where guests remained engaged and lively through the night was a testament to their status and influence. Imagine the subtle dynamics at play. a host's watchful eye ensuring the mood remained elevated, subtle glances exchanged among guests signaling mutual endurance and solidarity. Yet, beneath the surface of clapping hands and fixed smiles, the ritual exacted a quiet toll. Guests returned to their chambers drained, their bodies aching from hours of forced cheer. The memory of such nights was often tinged with a sense of relief mixed with regret, a longing for freedom from the demands of social expectation. Reflecting on this ritual offers insight into the complex interplay between individual experience and collective custom. It reveals how social rituals can simultaneously bind communities and impose constraints, shaping not just behavior but emotional life. The forced revelry was a dance of appearances, a delicate balance between duty and desire, connection and exhaustion. So as you imagine the long, candlelit night where faces smile and hands applaud, think also of the quiet moments behind those smiles, the wish to rest, the risk of stepping away, and the unspoken bonds that held everyone in place. In that shared endurance lies a story of human connection, shaped as much by what was endured as by what was celebrated. The salt cellar placement that exposed your rank instantly. Imagine yourself seated at a grand wooden table, polished smooth by years of countless gatherings, beneath the muted glow of candlelight flickering softly in a spacious medieval hall. Before you rests a small but significant object, a salt cellar, modest in size yet heavy with meaning. In this setting, the placement of this simple container could speak volumes without a single word being uttered. Salt, a precious and costly commodity in the medieval world, was more than just a seasoning. It was a symbol of wealth, power, and social distinction. The salt cellar's location on the table was carefully arranged by the host, a subtle but unmistakable marker of rank among the assembled guests. To be seated above the salt meant proximity to honor, influence, and favor, while those below the salt found themselves quietly relegated to lesser status. This arrangement was no mere accident. The salt cellar was often positioned centrally near the lord or host, dividing the table into two distinct sections. Guests seated on the host's side enjoyed the privilege of being above the salt, an invisible boundary signaling social superiority. Those on the opposite side were below the salt, a categorization understood intuitively and observed keenly by all present. Imagine the quiet tension that this division could generate. Without a single announcement, the salt cellar's placement drew clear lines among friends and rivals alike. To be assigned below the salt was not simply an inconvenience. It could be a lasting social slight, a visible reminder of one's lower standing. Chronicles of the era often note the sensitivities surrounding such arrangements, recording how guests sometimes harbored resentment or withdrew favor because of this silent judgment. The weight of this small container extended beyond the feast itself. The salt cellar's position became a point of reference in relationships and alliances. Invitations might be scrutinized for their seating arrangements, and the subtle message of salt placement could influence negotiations and favor long after the meal concluded. Consider the cultural context. Medieval society was highly hierarchical and attentive to symbolism. The salt cellar functioned as a nonverbal language, a social code that everyone at the table knew how to read. It was a reminder that in this world, status was carefully maintained and publicly displayed through myriad rituals and signals, even in the most ordinary of objects. The salt itself, harvested from distant sources and transported at great cost, embodied value and rarity. To share salt was to share a bond, a gesture of trust and friendship. Yet, by separating diners with its placement, the salt cellar also underscored division and rank, reinforcing social boundaries in a subtle but unmistakable manner. Imagine the host, aware of the power held in this arrangement, carefully setting the salt cellar in its place before the guests arrived. The act was deliberate, a quiet assertion of authority and order. Guests, arriving and taking their seats, immediately recognized their assigned place in this social structure, the salt cellar's position confirming their rank without a word. At the table, conversation flowed beneath this watchful symbol. Some guests accepted their position with grace, understanding the expectations of courtly life, while others may have felt the sting of exclusion, their eyes flickering toward the salt cellar as a reminder of their place. the salt cellar's presence was a constant companion to the feast, as present and influential as the food itself. This practice reveals much about the nuances of medieval social interaction, how power was negotiated not only through words and actions but through objects and spatial arrangements. The salt cellar was a silent adjudicator, dispensing honor or slight with quiet efficiency. As you imagine yourself amidst this scene, consider the delicate balance of pride and humility, acceptance and subtle protest that surrounded such a simple item. The salt cellar was more than a container. It was a mirror reflecting the intricate hierarchies of its time, an unspoken language that shaped relationships and left impressions lasting far beyond the meal. In this quiet division, the salt cellar encapsulated the rhythm of medieval life, where every gesture, every placement, carried meaning, and where the weight of social standing could rest upon something as unassuming as a humble dish of salt. The dishes sent as signals no one could refuse. Imagine yourself in the flickering glow of a grand medieval hall, where long tables groan beneath the weight of lavish feasts. The air is thick with the mingled scents of roasting meats, spiced herbs, and freshly baked bread, all underscored by the murmur of gathered guests. Yet beneath this atmosphere of celebration and abundance, an unspoken tension weaves through the crowd, an invisible thread tied to the very dishes placed before you. In these halls, food was never merely nourishment or pleasure. It was a language, a cipher spoken through carefully chosen ingredients and artful presentation. Hosts would dispatch plates carrying rare delicacies, gifts that went beyond hospitality to serve as silent tests of loyalty and allegiance. These dishes, exotic spices from distant lands, the flesh of elusive game, or carefully preserved sweets, were tokens loaded with meaning. To accept such a dish was to agree, without words, to the host's cause, to pledge support or tacit approval of plans whispered in shadowed corners. Imagine the weight of this choice pressing upon each guest. The delicacy offered was a rare honor but also a trap. To refuse was to risk suspicion, to cast oneself as an outsider or even an adversary. Declining could lead to subtle ostracism, whispered rumors, or worse, the slow erosion of favor that might decide one's fate in court or battle. Yet accepting was no simple delight. It was a commitment wrapped in the folds of soft meat or sugared fruit, binding the eater to a cause that might carry great risk. In many recorded feasts, chronicles describe the silence that fell as plates were passed along. Guests, faces composed and voices hushed, weighed their options beneath steady gazes. No one wished to appear too eager, yet no one dared to refuse. The tension was palpable, a quiet game played through food rather than words. The eyes met only briefly before shifting away, the subtle exchange of glances replaced by careful masking smiles or polite nods. These culinary signals were part of a wider tapestry of medieval communication, where the spoken word was often too dangerous or insufficient. The dishes sent as tokens carried a layered meaning understood only by those versed in courtly customs and alliances. Accepting a rare fish from the northern seas might imply support for a distant ally. Partaking in a delicately spiced pie could signal readiness to join a political faction. Each bite was a silent pact, a piece of a larger, intricate game where trust and suspicion danced side by side. The ritual extended beyond the feast itself. Later, those who received such offerings found their loyalty scrutinized, their actions measured against the silent contract signed with their acceptance. The shared meal became a battlefield of social survival, where subtle gestures spoke louder than proclamations. This interplay of food and power reflected the constant struggle to navigate shifting alliances in a world where survival often depended on who you stood beside and who you quietly declined. Imagine the sensory experience of these moments, the coolness of a silver platter carrying glistening delicacies, the delicate aroma of rare spices wafting through the hall, the soft rustle of silk garments as guests reached out, the muted clink of fine cutlery against the plate. Yet beneath these pleasures, a current of unease flowed, a reminder that every morsel carried more than flavor, it carried consequence. This practice reveals much about the rhythm of medieval life, where power was woven into the everyday, and survival demanded constant vigilance. The dishes sent as signals were at once gifts and tests, binding guests into webs of obligation that could shape kingdoms and destinies. They remind us that even in moments of communal celebration, beneath the surface of shared abundance, the rhythm of caution and calculation beat quietly on. As the feast continued and the plates passed, each guest navigated this delicate balance. Imagine yourself among them, tasting the richness offered while measuring the weight of unspoken expectations. In this dance of food and allegiance, the simple act of accepting a dish became a statement, a silent voice in the grand, enduring conversation of power. And so, through the vessels of rare delicacies, the rhythm of medieval loyalty pulsed steadily, weaving bonds as fragile and complex as the flavors on each plate. The musicians who observed as well as entertained, imagine yourself in the midst of a grand medieval feast, the air alive with the soft melodies of lutes, harps, and flutes weaving through the vast hall. The musicians move gracefully between tables, their fingers deftly coaxing music from strings and pipes, their tunes both soothing and stirring. But these performers are more than mere entertainers. They are the unseen eyes and ears of the court, observers as much as artists, their attentiveness as sharp as their skill with their instruments. In the intricate social world of medieval nobility, every gesture, glance, and expression carried weight. Music filled the spaces between conversation, but it also served a subtler purpose, as a cloak for observation. Chroniclers from the era record how musicians were instructed not only to delight the guests but also to watch closely, noting reactions and recording impressions to be relayed to the lord or lady presiding over the feast. Imagine a noble guest caught with a fleeting grimace during a particular melody or a subtle tightening of the lips at a jest sung softly between verses. Such seemingly small expressions could signal dissatisfaction, disagreement, or worse, disloyalty. The musicians, trained in discretion and diplomacy, committed these details to memory, knowing that their reports might influence a guest's standing or the host's understanding of loyalties. This dual role of the musician was part of the broader rhythm of medieval court life, where entertainment and politics were often intertwined. Music was a language beyond words, and the responses it elicited could reveal the undercurrents of power, alliance, and rivalry at play. Imagine the musicians moving with practiced ease, their presence both welcomed and carefully measured. A living bridge between the gaiety of the feast and the serious business of court intrigue. The attentiveness of the musicians speaks to the delicate balance guests had to maintain. Amidst the laughter and song, every smile was scrutinized, every sigh interpreted. The hall became a theater not only for celebration but for subtle communication, where silence and sound blended to shape perceptions. The musicians' keen eyes and ears made them vital participants in this dance, wielding influence behind the scenes through their quiet observations. This role required more than musical talent. It demanded acute social intelligence and discretion. Imagine the pressure on these performers, aware that a careless note or a missed cue might draw suspicion, yet also knowing that their silence was a safeguard. They were trusted to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics with grace, their artistry entwined with espionage. Beyond their observational duties, these musicians contributed to the atmosphere of the feast, their melodies setting the tone, whether joyful, contemplative, or celebratory. The music's ebb and flow mirrored the shifting dynamics among guests, reinforcing mood and meaning in ways words alone could not. Their songs could flatter, soothe, or subtly admonish, reflecting the host's intent and the tenor of the gathering. In considering the musician's place in medieval society, we glimpse a world where roles overlapped and appearances could deceive. The performer was never simply an entertainer but often a keeper of secrets and a recorder of subtle signs. Their presence reminds us that even in moments of seeming leisure, history's forces were quietly at work. As you imagine the soft strains of music weaving through the banquet hall, picture the musicians' vigilant eyes, watching, remembering, interpreting. Their melodies tell stories not just of harmony but of hidden meanings, where every note is part of a larger, unseen conversation. The musicians who observed as well as entertained stand as a testament to the complexity and nuance of medieval court life, where art and observation walked hand in hand beneath the flickering candlelight. The flickering candles that revealed too much and too little. Imagine yourself stepping into a vast medieval banquet hall, where dozens of candles flicker softly on ornate sconces and tall candelabras. The golden flames dance gently, their light wavering across stone walls, rich tapestries, and polished wooden tables. This flickering illumination creates an ever-shifting landscape of shadows and highlights, a subtle theater where secrets and messages moved as much by light as by words. The candles were both a blessing and a curse. Their warm glow brought life and warmth to the vast, often chilly spaces, yet their uncertain light could betray as much as it concealed. Imagine the delicate interplay of shadow and shimmer on parchment as important documents or letters passed quietly between nobles. A sudden breath, a slight draft, might cause a flame to flicker, revealing a glimpse of words never meant to be seen, or plunging a secret into sudden darkness. In these grand halls, discretion was a precious commodity. The passing of papers, whether letters, decrees, or coded notes, was fraught with risk. Imagine a noble leaning close to another, their faces half hidden in the gloom, exchanging messages with careful gestures. The wavering candlelight played tricks on the eyes, making it possible to glance without being noticed, or to mask movements behind a shifting shadow. Yet that very same flicker might betray a moment too revealing. A sudden gust from a door opening, a whispered breath, or the subtle movement of a curtain could cause a candle's flame to dance erratically. In that instant, the careful concealment could falter, and unintended eyes might catch a stray word or a revealing symbol. The fragile balance between exposure and secrecy hung on the quivering flames. Chroniclers and courtiers alike noted how the candlelight shaped the social dance of the feast. Conversations were punctuated not just by words but by glances caught in the glow, by gestures obscured or exposed by the shifting light. Imagine the tension as nobles exchanged not only pleasantries but veiled warnings or promises, all cloaked beneath the candlelit veil. The very architecture of the halls enhanced this interplay. High ceilings and narrow windows allowed drafts to weave their way through the space, causing the candles to flicker unpredictably. Tapestries, heavy and richly woven, swayed occasionally, casting large, looming shadows that could either hide or highlight movement. Imagine the atmosphere, the low murmur of voices, the gentle clink of glass, and the constant, soft flicker of flames. The scent of melted wax mingled with the rich aromas of spiced meats and fresh bread, creating a sensory backdrop to the delicate political maneuvers unfolding in the light and shadow. For those skilled in the art of court intrigue, the candlelight was a tool to be mastered. Knowing when to move, when to lean in or pull away, when to reveal a document or conceal it just out of sight, required a careful reading of both the room and the flames. Imagine the practiced eyes watching for any telltale shimmer, any moment when a letter might be glimpsed. Even the servants who moved silently among the guests were part of this dance. Their careful placement of candles, their discreet adjustment of curtains or tapestries, all influenced how light and shadow played across the hall. Their work was unseen but essential, a subtle hand guiding the atmosphere of secrecy and revelation. As you imagine yourself within this flickering world, consider how the uncertain candlelight shaped not only what was seen, but what was understood. The glow could illuminate alliances or cast suspicion, reveal plans or hide betrayals. It was a light both gentle and sharp, a silent witness to the whispered dramas of power. In this way, the flickering candles transformed the banquet hall into a place where truth and deception moved together, cast in alternating pools of light and shadow. Imagine the tension held in that soft glow, the knowledge that every flame might reveal too much or conceal just enough to change the course of a night, a lifetime, or a kingdom. The grand entrances that demanded perfect composure equals imagine yourself standing just beyond the heavy oak doors of a great medieval hall, the murmur of voices and the clinking of goblets rising faintly from within. The room falls suddenly silent as those doors swing open and every eye turns toward you. This moment of arrival, your grand entrance, is more than a simple crossing of a threshold. It is a carefully staged performance, where every step, every gesture, and every breath is measured against the exacting standards of composure and dignity. Chroniclers of the period often remarked on the intense pressure felt by guests as they made their way into the hall. The very act of walking down the long aisle between rows of seated nobles and dignitaries was charged with expectation. Imagine the steady gaze of dozens of eyes fixed upon you, the silence thick enough to catch the softest shuffle of feet on stone. To trip, falter, or reveal hesitation was not merely embarrassing. It was a social misstep that could ripple through one's reputation for weeks, even years. This grand entrance served multiple purposes. It was a declaration of status, a moment to assert one's place within the intricate hierarchy of court life. Each guest's attire, bearing, and confidence were scrutinized, a silent language spoken through posture and poise. The hall itself was designed to amplify this effect. High vaulted ceilings echoed footsteps, the polished floor reflected every movement, and the arrangement of seating ensured maximum visibility. Imagine the grandeur and weight of such a setting, where the architecture conspired with social custom to create a stage for personal display. For many, the anticipation was a source of quiet dread. Chroniclers capture the anxiety of those moments before crossing the threshold. The tightening of the chest, the quickened heartbeat, the deliberate control of expression. The risk of a misstep was real and consequential. Yet, guests knew that success meant more than avoiding embarrassment. It was a chance to impress the host and peers alike, to affirm alliances and open doors to favor. The ritual of entrance also reflected broader social values of the time. The emphasis on perfect composure mirrored the importance placed on order, respect, and decorum in the rigid structures of medieval society. It was a visible reminder that every individual was part of a larger system, where personal behavior reinforced collective norms. Imagine the subtle exchanges that accompanied these moments. A slight nod from a noble, a whispered compliment, or a quick glance of approval. These small signals could carry immense weight in determining one's standing. Conversely, a stumble or uncertain step might invite gossip or quiet judgment, a shadow cast upon one's reputation. Yet, beyond the surface, these grand entrances reveal the human dimension of medieval social life, a mixture of pride, vulnerability, and the desire to belong. The hall was not just a physical space but a theater of interaction where appearances mattered deeply, and where the silent gaze of the assembled guests shaped the course of relationships. As you picture the scene, the hushed hall, the spotlight of attention, the measured steps, consider how this moment encapsulates the rhythm of life at court. The grand entrance was both an invitation and a test, a blend of ceremony and personal challenge that echoed long after the feast began. So, when next you imagine a great medieval hall alive with feasting and celebration, remember the quiet tension in that first step through the door, the careful dance of composure and courage that shaped the unfolding story of the evening. In that stillness before the applause, history waits, watching as each guest makes their entrance into the ever-turning pageant of medieval life. The unpredictable seating changes that tested your patience. Imagine yourself at a grand banquet, the long table set with gleaming plates and polished goblets, guests gathered in their finely embroidered attire, faces eager yet composed. The atmosphere hums with quiet conversation, the clink of cutlery, and the soft glow of candlelight reflecting off tapestries adorning the stone walls. Seating arrangements, carefully planned before the feast began, have placed each guest in a position signaling status, favor, or alliance, a delicate balance of social order. But midway through the meal, the host rises, commanding attention without haste or urgency. A subtle shift begins. Servants move swiftly yet discreetly, whispering instructions as they approach select guests. Chairs are quietly withdrawn and repositioned, bodies guided with practiced politeness to new seats. The room holds its breath, the air charged with an unspoken tension. These unpredictable seating changes are no mere matter of logistics. They are deliberate assertions of power. To be moved from a place of honor to one less favorable was a test of patience and composure. Imagine the guest who, with a measured smile, rises calmly to obey, hiding any flicker of disappointment behind courteous expressions. In this world, acceptance was not optional, it was demanded. To resist or show displeasure could provoke gossip, damage reputation, or even invite the host's displeasure, an outcome best avoided. These mid-meal adjustments served multiple purposes. For the host, they were a way to remind guests of their authority, to unsettle alliances, or to signal shifting favors. The movement of bodies around the table was a silent dialogue, a visible representation of hierarchy and control. Chronicles from the period note instances where such changes sparked murmurs and anxiety among diners, revealing the delicate balance of courtly life. Consider the logistics. Moving guests required grace and precision. Servants, trained in the art of discretion, ensured that transitions were smooth, voices low, gestures polite. Yet beneath the surface, the emotional currents ran deep. The subtle humiliation of losing a prime seat, the place nearest the host or closest to the best dishes, was palpable. Yet the expectation remained firm. Smiles must not waver, and acceptance must be immediate. This practice reflects the nuanced dance of medieval social interaction, where power was constantly negotiated through ritual and behavior. Seating was never merely functional. It was a language of influence and submission expressed through spatial relationships. The unpredictability of these changes kept guests alert, aware that their status could shift at any moment. Imagine the ripple effect around the table. Guests exchanging glances, recalculating alliances, masking their feelings behind composed facades. The meal continued, plates replenished, goblets refilled, but the underlying message lingered: power was fluid, and patience was a currency as valuable as gold. The experience was a testament to the rhythm of medieval life, where endurance, subtlety, and restraint shaped social survival. Guests learned to navigate these shifts with skill, balancing ambition with decorum, always mindful that a quiet smile could shield them from deeper consequences. As you picture this scene, you glimpse the intricate social choreography that defines such gatherings, a world where even a chair's placement carried meaning, and where the ability to accept the unpredictable was a mark of grace and wisdom. In this silent contest of wills, the shifting seats spoke volumes, reminding all present that power was not fixed but danced constantly between those who held it and those who sought to keep it, all beneath the gentle flicker of candlelight in the great halls of medieval times. The recorded menus that became permanent records of favor. Imagine yourself in the quiet, dimly lit chamber of a medieval scribe, the scent of parchment mingling with the faint flicker of candlelight. Before him lies an open ledger, its pages filled with careful, flowing script. Here, in these meticulous records, the details of grand banquets are preserved, not merely as menus of food served, but as documents imbued with profound social significance. Each name inscribed, each dish noted, becomes a thread in the complex tapestry of medieval politics and favor. In the medieval world, hospitality was a currency as vital as gold or land. The grand feast was more than a celebration. It was a stage where power was displayed and alliances forged. Hosts employed scribes to record not only the guests who attended but also precisely what they were served. These menus, far from being simple lists, served as permanent records of favor and standing. The choice of dishes, the quality of the portions, even the order in which they were served, all carried messages about rank, trust, and respect. Imagine the scribe's careful hand tracing each name beside an array of delicacies, succulent meats, rare spices, delicate pastries. Each dish a symbol of the host's regard or warning. To be recorded as receiving the finest cuts or the most coveted plates was a mark of distinction. Conversely, subtle omissions or lesser servings were no accident. They were deliberate signals, encoded in the language of hospitality. A guest left unlisted or noted as served a humble dish faced the risk of exclusion from future favors, whispered suspicion, or public slight. These records held weight far beyond the walls of the banquet hall. Nobles and courtiers would reference them when considering alliances or rivalries. A scribe's entry could sway opinions, affecting marriages, military support, or political negotiations. Chroniclers sometimes discovered that a single omission in a menu was interpreted as a calculated insult, sparking tension that lingered long after the plates had been cleared and the fires had dimmed. Imagine the atmosphere as these records were reviewed. Faces studied the pages with quiet intensity, memories of feasts blending with calculations of strategy. The menus became tools not only of documentation but of power. They shaped perceptions, reinforced hierarchies, and even settled scores in a world where words spoken aloud were often fraught with danger. The sensory world of these banquets contrasts sharply with the sterile precision of the records. While guests enjoyed the warmth of the hearth, the rich aromas of spiced dishes, and the convivial murmur of companions, the scribe's chamber was quiet, focused, and exacting. Here, the ephemeral pleasures of the feast were transformed into lasting legacies, ink on parchment that carried consequences far beyond any single meal. This practice reveals much about the rhythm of medieval society, how the ordinary act of dining became interwoven with the extraordinary demands of status and survival. The recorded menus stand as a testament to the subtle yet enduring power of ritual, where every detail mattered and every omission spoke volumes. And so, through these careful inscriptions, the rhythm of favor and rivalry beat steadily onward, echoing across halls and centuries alike.